Welcome to the Brilliant Fertility Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katie Rose, and this podcast exists to help illuminate the path ahead of you. With expert interviews, clinical pearls, and real client success stories, my intention is to bring you hope for what's possible on this journey and to give you tools and resources to navigate the ups and downs on the road before you. If you find this podcast helpful, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite listening platform. And I have a big request. If you have a minute, can you leave us a 5-star review? And let us know, what did you learn? What did you come away with? Did you leave with that spark of hope? This helps more people like you find the podcast. My mission is to support as many humans as possible on their path to become parent. And by you sharing and subscribing, you're part of that mission too. And I'm so grateful for you for being here. Welcome back to the Brilliant Fertility Podcast. I am so honored to have our guest here today, Stacey Ramsower. Stacey is a somatic coach specializing in women's sexual and reproductive health. She runs some amazing programs focused on rage and grief in motherhood, sexuality, desire, self-discovery, and this work is so needed. It's always been needed, and I think now more than ever, we are being called towards this path. So we're going to be getting into all things somatics and emotional processing in motherhood and women's health, and I can't wait to dig in. So Stacey, thank you for being here.
I'm so excited to be here, and I always love the experience of having my bio read, and it's like, woo, this is cool. I do cool things. You just get like in it. I'm being an entrepreneur, which there's so much that takes up so much time and energy. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you because I love you, and to get to be in, sort of feminine form conversation about the work, but also to be reminded the why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know about you with the bio being read back part. There's like a part of me that's maybe still 16 years old that's like, what? You do that?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
wild.
Exactly. How did this happen?
Yeah, well,
Is this real?
that is really a good question. Like, how
Mm.
were you called to do this work?
I never really followed a straight path. I've always been, for better or worse, really guided by my intuition and feeling, and have trusted that, and to a large degree was really supported to do that by my family. Although I think for a while there, they were like, what is happening? But I grew up dancing, and my body was always a source of power and wisdom for me. And I've said this in most of my interviews, especially lately, but the best thing my mom gave me as a mother was instilling in me a knowing that my body is a place where I should feel pleasure. It's normal and it's healthy and it's right to take pleasure in my body. And when I was old, I actually started asking questions about sex very young. No surprise there, but I love the way that my mom ushered me through that and always answered my questions honestly, but it was also with this sense of like, it's normal.
Yeah.
And it should feel good. And that's what you should be orienting to. You should be orienting to experiences that feel good. And something that she said over and over to me throughout my life, if it doesn't feel right, it's not. And I think that there's something about that simple phrase that really helped me hone my own instinct about where I should be going. So at times it was scary because I'm like, I don't know what, honestly, I don't know what I'm doing, but I feel very clear that I've always found my way back to my path, and it's always been guiding me toward working with women, honoring the body, celebrating the body, honing the power inherent in the body.
Yeah. That's a really, unfortunately, unique experience
I
to
know.
have had such an early guide into that intuition and safety and allowing one to feel pleasure. And having had that so early, like, how has that felt as you've, approached this world in which we have a lot of us who were really conditioned to rely on our intellect
Hmm.
and to rely on, like, well, what does my logical mind want me to do, and like, what does this mean, and like, how does that urge to understand potentially, I don't want to say blocking, but potentially like steering us off course.
Hmm. Um, well, I believe in it in my work. It's largely that, like most of the women that I work with. And I think this is a function of women being conditioned to distrust their body and for it to be quite unsafe, actually, in most circumstances, to live from body and pleasure. Um, Safety is found in intellect and being one step ahead of everyone and knowing more than everyone. And so that's when that sort of patterning is developed from a really early age, it is subconscious. It
Yeah.
is the default, like this is safety. And so it takes a lot of really slow and gentle work to repattern ourselves into it's not taking away anything from our intellectual capacity. I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, and so the work is about giving power and place to all of our instincts in the way that they show up. They show up emotionally, they show up physically, they show up through thought, they show up through sensation. So it's not about a hierarchy, it's about having access to all of our tools. And I think that piece is really largely misunderstood when it comes to somatic work. It's not about it's the same thing with like patriarchy versus matriarchy. The healing is eradicating the hierarchy
Hmm.
and working in partnership with all of it.
Hearing you say that just felt like this deep breath
Ooh.
of release within my heart space. So thank you for
Mm.
that. And I'm glad that you kind of backed up there for a second, because I was like, oh, we kind of went deep really fast. And some of our listeners might still
Yeah.
be like, wait, how did we get there? What is somatic experiencing? What is a
Yes.
somatic coach? Back up. So let's rewind a little bit and
We got time,
so
folks.
what?
Don't worry.
Sorry, we just go. So I guess just giving a little bit of background on, like, what is a somatic experience practitioner? What does that practice mean?
Somatic experiencing was developed by a man named Peter Levine, and it's been developed by the people he's trained and students all over the world over decades now. And it was developed specifically to treat PTSD because, and if anyone's read The Body Keeps the Score, that's Bessel van der Kolk, that's not Peter Levine, but a similar understanding. If you're working with trauma through cognitive function, cognitive behavioral therapy, you're talking to the wrong part of the brain. Trauma affects us at the base of the brain stem, our primitive brain, our instinctual brain. And that is movement, sensation, emotion, the sort of subcategories in terms of how society approaches a person. So, as I was mentioning before, somatic experiencing um, enables a person to have more flexibility in their responses to circumstances. Trauma responses are developed from a place of not having any other option based on our perception of the moment, which again is happening so fast. We're not thinking about it. The body is just oriented to how do I survive this?
Mm-hmm.
And trauma can be a huge one-time event. It can be little tiny ongoing events that we don't have the skills, the tools, the support to integrate, which I would, given that definition, everyone has a trauma response deeply embedded in their body, their psyche. So I work with folks in a pretty, I don't know if casual is the right word, but it's the word that's coming. My work is conversational with a person. Most of the time, almost all the time, people come to me with a quote unquote problem. And our work together is about just slowing down the thinking function to give space to noticing what's actually happening in your body. What's a story, perhaps, that's deeply embedded in that posture in your body, in that gesture you keep making? And possibly, could we cultivate the experience of being with this, overwhelming seeming emotion or sensation for a bit longer to prove to your brain it's not actually going to kill you.
Yeah.
It's not actually going to kill you to cry. It's not actually going to kill you to feel rage, to feel grief. And there is so much power in doing this work relationally. That's actually a key part of it. The way we are designed as human mammals is to exist relationally.
Yeah.
This whole notion of like how to self-regulate is, that is an important function. But if you're not able to co-regulate, you're never going to be able to self-regulate. And relationship is where 99% of us experience our trauma.
Bingo. Yes. And you say it so eloquently that my brain just like went into trance, that I was just like, yes, like this has absolutely been my experience. And of course, with the population that I primarily work with, people who have struggled to conceive, people who have experienced losses,
Yeah.
that innately adds to the trauma. And because our medical system doesn't acknowledge that aspect, it just compounds. And when we don't have the safe spaces to talk about it, to relate to it, to heal, to hear other people's stories, to know that we're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
there's isolation that occurs. And often by the time people get to me, like I'm kind of the woo-woo last resort, like, well, I've done all the things, so now I'm going to go see this hippie. And
This hippie who went to medical school, just saying.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I work quite differently, and
Yeah.
so I'm rarely someone's first stop,
Right.
right? When they've been through the system, when they've been on the merry-go-round of like the Western medical model that says, oh, well, try for years, see what happens. Oh, you had one miscarriage, these things happen. Oh, you've had two miscarriages, you got to wait till three till we test anything. And then they're
Mm.
just shuffled down this conveyor belt of, well, we can try IUI, we can try IVF. Well, if that doesn't work, maybe you should just get donor eggs. You should adopt. I mean, there's not the conversations happening about like, hey, I see you in
Right.
this.
Right.
And
I would suggest the most radical thing that I offer anyone is present witness and compassion. Most of us approach our healing, and I know this is what you work with also. I have a problem and I need to fix it. I need to eradicate it. My work is entirely based on, okay, well, let's get curious about how this is a self-protective mechanism. What are you protecting yourself from, and how is that really wise? And then how is that protection maybe based on something from the past and not actually necessary anymore? Let's thank this part of you that has been so diligent in keeping you safe, but is overstayed its welcome, or, just getting in the way of you experiencing something else. And I like this language a lot. One of the most important things in the style of work that I do is learning to notice what's not wrong and developing that capacity to notice what's not wrong, regardless of what's going on. And this is not bypassing. This is not silver lining. This is not positive affirmation. This is what's factually not a threat in my present moment, so that this intense sensation, this intense emotion, this intrusive thought has some balance, has some ballast for me to investigate it or feel it and let it run its course. Because if you've scheduled time to sit down at a computer and jump on a Zoom call, there's no immediate threat, right? Like, I'm not working with someone in a high intensity situation generally. That doesn't mean on some level your system isn't running that program, that there's a life-threatening problem. And that's where we get the more deeply rooted physical ailments.
Yes. One of my hypnosis mentors, Melissa Tears, has a statement that she has, and she's so New York, right?
I love it.
But it's, what is everything you're noticing that's not that?
Mm-hmm.
And I just love how it's like, it just flips on that other side of the brain. It's like, oh,
Right.
I have an option.
Yes.
I have another option. And I love that statement so much, even though it's a little bit of a mind fuck at first when you're like, wait, what? What's not
Mm-hmm.
that? And observing that it's not bypassing is important. I hear so often people who are are tr- really, because it's so uncomfortable, I believe they're wanting to reach for, well, I should just be grateful for this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've had this loss, I've had this grief, I have this rage, and I don't want to feel it. I don't have the resources to feel it. So I'm just going to be like, well, I should be grateful for this. I should be grateful that I have this career. I should be grateful that I have my husband. How is that a different experience than asking the mind to notice what is not that trauma response?
That I should just be grateful. Or I had a client who was working through some pretty significant grief. And she's like, I know there's beauty here. And I was like, but it's ugly. This is ugly. And so by bypassing that fact that this doesn't feel good, or I don't want this, it's the same thing as saying yes to a sexual experience you don't want. It's a suppression of your instinct. It's a suppression of the fact of the matter. But the fact of the matter is often more broad spectrum than we're able to notice because of that, priming as human mammals. We're going to notice the problem so we can steer clear of it. But we also are developed enough as human mammals to also notice these like gorgeous fucking purple roses that I got at Trader Joe's yesterday, right there. And chamomile. They're selling bunches of chamomile flowers at Trader Joe's. I made myself this
Runs to
awesome
Trader Joe.
little, damn, it's so good. The dark chocolate with 30% whole hazelnuts. Oh my God. And like, it is so critical that we have access to that just wash of like, genuine gratitude. You don't have to be grateful for your pregnancy loss, but are you grateful for your roof over your head? Steer your gratitude towards something that's actually true and available so that you can cultivate an authentic relationship to the pain, and it'll shift. I mean, it's the same thing with forgiveness. People jump to forgiveness without ever allowing themselves to feel the hatred and the rage and the resentment, and it never quite settles in. because it's inauthentic. It's like, and I sometimes I struggle to not go like deep into theory of somatic experiencing, but I find it so fascinating. There's a principle at play in that work called titration, where you go slow when making changes because these patterns of self-protection are there for a reason. If you try to strip that away too fast, your system will double down in its effort to protect you. It'll shut down. Why anyone who's ever like gone on a crash diet has failed, because your system is like, no, I need sugar to feel safe, to feel in my body. You have to go slow. So the titration element you can see in like why some positive affirmations fail. Because if you don't actually have a living experience of the essence of the statement, you're just playing make believe.
Yeah. There's that part of you that's going to be like, this is bullshit.
This is
Why are
bullshit.
you trying to lay this on me?
So you
And
have to start with something that you can
yeah,
access in a real way in your body. Yeah.
yeah.
You got to like your body's so smart. It's like, mm-mm.
Mm. The body is so smart. And when as we sort of started out at the beginning of this conversation, talking about how our programming of relying on rationalization and intellect and how that can create some disconnect within the
Yeah.
body, some mistrust of the body and its
Mm.
sensations and its desires. I am curious because I know you do a lot of work with boundaries. How you relate that somatic experience and our boundaries.
Yeah. Boundaries are inherent to your physical experience, right? Your skin is a very clear boundary. All the trillions of cells in your body have an inherent built in boundary, an innate ability to recognize what belongs and what doesn't. And as you know, and most of your listeners know at this point, all of these elements work in concert with one another. So there's all of the systems have to work in concert with one another in order for that intrinsic capacity to say yes or no to function well. And I think that conditioning to over rely on our rational function. I mean, thought primarily, it's like 95% of the thoughts any one of us is having at any given moment are not our own. It's input from the external environment that is all based on buy this thing. Look over here, and buy this thing. This is how you will get what you want. It's over here. Flashy, flashy, looky, looky. Promises, promises. And I find that to be a really fascinating and important fact to consider when we're, contemplating the consequence of not being connected to our visceral body and not responding to, it's like not responding to a child who's crying. Well, you might think it's quote unquote silly, but what is that child's experience of being in distress and no one's looking? It's going to become wilder, bigger, more destructive until it just sort of shuts down. And that's when we get these body systems shutting down. And I have studied and practiced Ayurveda for a long time. And this is sort of taking a turn, but hopefully I'm not veering too far off course. But I find this to be really fascinating because autoimmune dysfunction affects women so much more than men. It's interesting, that fact on its own. But in Ayurveda, the understanding of autoimmune dysfunction is a forgetfulness. The body has forgotten itself. It's forgotten where it ends and something else begins. So it starts fighting itself as though it's the enemy. It can't recognize me. And so to bring it back to boundaries, boundaries are all about connection to self, protection of what is essential for our thriving. That's why we set boundaries. We don't set boundaries to reject, to keep out. I mean, most of us actually do, but what if we flipped that script and set boundaries as a means of connection? Boundaries are connection, boundaries are protection. And for whatever it's worth, because I think about this probably more than most people, while I appreciate the sentiment and support, I suppose, what's behind it, the slogan of resist, I find to be utter trash. I have better things to do with my life force than just work against something. My life force needs to create and generate and move forward. So how about persist? Like, how are we setting boundaries again that protect our desire, our intention? And if we don't have access to the body also, there's no way to know what your actual desire or intention is if you're just moving from thought, because thought is so muddled and so easily influenced by external forces. So that boundary work is connection, protection of self.
I'm really glad you brought up that piece about resist, because I too spend a lot of time thinking about these things, and especially within the world of fertility and the ideas of like the masculine and the feminine energy and how those play a role in fertility, especially, is the energetics of fertility is expansive.
Mm-hmm.
It's receptive. And so if, like, to me, when you say the word resist, it's like I feel like I'm putting the armor up, like I'm trying to like almost just like hunker down and make myself smaller in a
Mm,
way. And when I think about like how I am called to this work, it is like it's growth, it's expansion, it's authenticity.
yes.
And boundaries will be necessary because there will be people who push back against that. No, you're too loud, you're too much, you're too small. I don't like that. And to think about a boundary as connection is so different than I think how many people are assuming what a boundary
Mm-hmm.
can be. So thank you for bringing that up, because I hadn't actually like thought about the word resist until this moment. And we, yes, so yeah, my mind's just sort of blown right now, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going off in so many directions.
Well, and as like a simple example that I think most people can relate to, I have, historically, it's real difficult for me to be motivated to like get up and get out of the house and go somewhere to exercise. It would to get up and do it in my own home, like just to get, it's like when the focus is doing this hard thing, right? It's like pretty easy for me to make up excuses and drag my feet and just like avoid. But over the years, I've cultivated my ability to stay focused on the why and the yes around feel like physical strength to me feels so good. I love the feeling of having worked out. I love the feeling of having gone for a long walk or, done something vigorous with my body. I love that feeling. So my boundary is around my yes. My boundary is there to protect my yes, what I want. It's, again, we tend to, for reasons, set boundaries that reinforce our failings, that reinforce how we're not enough. You must do this, otherwise you're a piece of shit. No, I'm going to do this because I fucking love what it's like on the other side of this effort. I love that. And it's back to that, there's the masculine feminine interplay that is essential for life to be sustained, there's that effort put in place in service of this pulsation and this expansion. In, a lot of my background of practice and study is Tantra and the Vedic sciences. And in that image of Shiva and Shakti entwined with one another, the masculine force is steady, literally penetrating, steady. He's not going anywhere so that she can expand and like pulse and feel and experience and express.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to find that dance inside ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's also a really beautiful segue into talking about how somatic work supports intimacy. Juicy
Oh, yes.
goosebumps starting.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And with intimacy being such a potential challenge when
Yes.
people are struggling with fertility, because, like, oh, you gotta have sex if you want to make baby. And even, once people have ventured into IVF, where you take the physical act out of the picture, a lot of people come to me having almost forgotten intimacy. And
Mm-hmm.
that intimacy is greater than just having penetrative sex.
Yeah.
There's so much more at play there. So let's talk about that.
Well, I think it is wonderful that there's this looping theme, right? Because the mind works so fast. The essence of the mind of thought is very fast. And so if we are predominantly living in thought, intimacy is really difficult because intimacy is a slow unfolding. Intimacy is moment to moment. It's not end goal. There's no way to have an authentic, intimate experience if we're projecting what the end goal should be and what, in there is what we expect the other person to do and why don't they know this and why, oh my God, I just can't even anymore. So somatic work supports intimacy in that it supports people learning to slow down and find relative safety in the awkwardness, in the spaciousness, in the moments of, I don't know what I want, which is where most people shut down because it feels way too exposed, even with your partner. This is like my cute little phrase. If you don't have, well, I'll say it properly. The secret to lasting good sex is the ability to be disappointed. If you don't have it in your system to be disappointed by an experience and try again, well, there's probably not going to be many experiences for you. It's a process. And so it's also the last thing that I really want to say about it is so much of sex is closely connected to that brain stem, the place where trauma occurs, which is largely pre-verbal. So it can be difficult to feel safe enough or even present enough to communicate what we need in order to feel safe to move forward. And that's part of the work, is slowing it down, me holding space for someone to have an experience and know that it's okay to not know, to gather evidence to the contrary of whatever that voice in their head has been telling them for years and years and years and years. It's actually okay to not know. You don't need to know everything. But is there a gesture you could make to express what you're feeling? Is there a word? Is there a sound? Can you imagine a word? You don't even have to say it out loud yet. And it's a slow unraveling of this conditioned response to vulnerability, which is shut down, harden, stiffen, resist. And I don't work currently with couples, but that is, probably next year. Like that's where I want to take my work more and spend more of my time, is working with couples, because that's actually how I shifted from birth work to somatic work. I attended my first birth as a doula and I was like hooked. I was like, this is the fucking greatest thing. I'm going to be a midwife. All I want to do is watch babies be born all day and see women in their power. And then I started sitting down with couples, who were interviewing me to be their doula. And I was like, okay, pivot. We got to be a sex therapist because there is so much crazy shit going on out there. I don't even know what to say. And again, there's that like interplay of something I've taken for granted because I did have an unusual experience growing up and learning about sex and sexuality. That does not by any means mean that I've avoided pain or awkwardness or strife. And even in my experience of birthing two children, my sex life has transformed I've had to work at it. And even with this sort of like generous beginning, it's
Yeah.
taken work. So I'm very passionate about it. I'm very passionate about it.
I feel like when you mentioned disappointment, like the secret to a long-standing good sex life is like that ability to be disappointed and to try again. There's such an overlap for everyone out there who is also
Oh,
wanting a baby
yeah.
and having that monthly disappointment.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder, and I know this is nuanced and there's going to be probably a different experience for everyone out there, but any immediate resourcing that you can think of for being with that discomfort of disappointment?
Mm, yes. The mind, as I said, is really, it creates like a vortex, right? It just sucks us out of our body. So when there have been losses or pregnancy is just not happening, the mind can get really spinny. And, memories and all this stuff starts flashing before our eyes. If we can find where in the body there is stillness, and it might not even be in your body, it might be the fact of, like, this is something that I always say in session: where is your ass? What is it doing? If you can just feel your ass against whatever you're sitting on, or your feet against the floor if you're not sitting, and give your attention over to the fact of sensation, right? There's no emotional context to my ass on the floor. That doesn't conjure any feelings. So it's a counterpoint for that, racing, spinning montage of disappointment. And sometimes that it's like stopping a moving train, right? Sometimes that can be pretty extreme. So one of the big tools in somatic experiencing, the way I teach, practice these things when you don't need to.
Yes.
5 times a day, stop and ask yourself, where is my ass and what is it doing? So that you start to build into your system an access point to what is not wrong. Nothing wrong with my ass on the floor, right? Again, there's no emotional context to it. Look out the window. I've got these gorgeous silver dollar eucalyptus trees on my property. And they just like the branches drape down my bedroom window and my office window. And oh God, I love them so much. So just that's my go-to. The visual element is actually quite helpful when the mind is really agitated. It can be difficult to go straight to sensation.
Yeah.
So again, 5 times a day for quote unquote no reason at all, look out the window and notice something beautiful. So that when the overwhelm settles, there's a built-in memory of, oh, there's somewhere I can go that isn't this. And it's not to avoid it, but it's to get you breathing. It's to get you in a state of relative safety in order to be able to be with the feelings that feel threatening.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the reminder that practicing these things before you need them is going to, it's strengthening that muscle.
That's
right?
when you're going to quote unquote progress, right? You build the muscle away from the strain of the emotional turmoil.
Um, and I also love how quick those are. You don't need to go find an entire hour to meditate about something. It's like 30 seconds.
I promise it will make a difference.
And that's huge. Like that for so many people, I hope is just such a reminder at how powerful the little things are
Mm-hmm.
and how much space that can give us.
I will sometimes um, narrate my experience. Again, I think about it like off ramps from the thinking. So, what's a simple off ramp that's still, it's not like stopping a fast moving train. It's just pumping the brakes a little bit, narrate like what I see in my space, something that I can do while I'm driving so I don't have to take my eyes off the road. I can narrate even where's my ass and what it's doing. There's so many ways, but what we can emphasize for folks is it doesn't take long. You don't need to have special equipment. You don't need to be in a specific location. It happens anywhere you are. And the more you can connect to these parts of yourself when you don't quote unquote need to, find a way to connect to a moment of calm, the pure experience of beauty, and not rush past it. I always like to say, when you're noticing something, right? Like I noticed the roses and the sweet little chamomile flowers. I noticed the way the sun hits these leaves is especially it. So I'm going to stay with that long enough to feel a state shift, which might be a spontaneous deep breath or my jaw unclenching. I didn't even know it was clenched. It might be tears, and I don't have to wonder why I'm crying. It's just my body establishing homeostasis, right? Like it's a sign of downregulation. Okay. And then go into whatever it is that is so important.
Yeah. I think I just experienced a state shift just
Mm.
hearing about the light coming off the little eucalyptus leaves. And I describe those moments in my practice as glimmers.
And,
Like,
not to interrupt you, but I think this is critical for where we're at collectively. And from what I understand, the sort of energetic of the new moon, the listening, what we're feeding our systems is so important. So you had this experience of downregulation of state shift, listening to me, orienting to what's not wrong, and describing my experience. When we listen to people in a completely flipped out, stressed out state, and I just titrate my intake of media. It's about titration and being realistic with yourself. What is this actually doing for you? And sometimes, when we're in a stressed out state, that's why caffeine feels good. That's why sugar feels good. That's why really harsh workouts feel good, because it's more of the same.
yeah,
It's hard to slow that down, but we have to be conscious of how we're feeding ourselves and perpetuating a cycle, who we're surrounding ourselves with and what we're allowing in and how often and when we're most susceptible to it, etc.
yeah. I think that's one of the critical boundaries,
Yes.
especially when we have this 24/7 access to media and remembering that our brain doesn't actually know the difference between our own traumatic experience or
Yeah.
witnessing that in the media
Yeah.
as well. And it's, maybe there's this misconception, and I've held this misconception. This is something that I had to work through of like, if I turn my back on witnessing the media, does it mean I'm a bad person? Does it mean I don't care?
You're complicit.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so
Well,
I
and
know
yeah,
that, yeah, I know that so many of our listeners are care deeply about humanity. And I think it's also very critical that we are taking care of ourselves.
and what you bring up at the heart of all of that, at the heart of all of this, the problem with so much media is that, knowing what's going on in Gaza, knowing what's going on in any of these places that are so far from us, puts us in a position of helplessness, which is the essence of trauma. I was helpless to do anything. So it immediately puts us in this incredibly heightened, activated cortisol adrenaline state that wreaks havoc on our bodies.
Yeah.
And again, it is very nuanced. I don't know what anyone else's threshold is for taking in this information, but I also, in this framework of boundaries are connection and what life force is meant to do, pick one thing that you can do, pick one action, contribute in some way deliberately to a thing that gives you feedback, and take responsibility for that. And if and when your capacity increases to participate more generously with another issue, because God knows there's countless, but we also have to hold the line as feelers, as empaths. We have to hold our own line because nobody's going to do that for you. And it's going to, we're going to slip and fall and have to pick it up and like recalibrate where the line is. Or you get, like me, 6 weeks of pretty intense illness and like, I don't have anything to give. I'm giving to my children right now. That doesn't make me a bad person.
Yeah, that knowing of your threshold, I have described it to my population as um, finding that radical honesty for how is this actually making you feel? What can you give? And remembering, I mean, it's the most cliche statement in the world at this point, but like you can't pour from an empty cup,
Yeah.
and it's so true.
And then we stay in I just believe I had someone say this to me years ago. And I really resented him saying it to me because of the context of the conversation, but I've actually repeated it to myself many, many times since. He was in finance. He was a yoga student of mine, and he said, markets write themselves. Markets always write themselves. And in this context of our conversation, I'm thinking of that statement in terms of I've had to really pull back. I've had to really bring my energy close to myself and not participate in much. And here we are having this conversation, generating enthusiasm and life force and interest and connection to one another. I feel like I do have more to give. So, okay, now's a great time to open my eyes and let my intuition guide me to what's the place to engage? Where can I participate more fully than I have been? Because I want to.
Absolutely. Yes, I resonate with that. And I think my version of where can I really make a difference is in my community. Knowing, like, actually honoring the gifts that I have, and uh, as someone who was raised to be humble and
Mm-hmm.
hide that,
Mm-hmm.
that's the work for me, right? And being able to say, who else in my community has gifts? How can I amplify their gifts? And that feels like I can do that.
Yeah.
And that helps. That will, this message getting to one person who was sitting in the well of disappointment, who can now look out their window and see a shift in light. like knowing that we might have made a difference for that person. It's like, okay, I can keep going.
That knowing that we're not alone.
Yeah. It's right. Oh, Stacey, my heart feels very full, and I'm so very glad to have had this conversation with you today. And I would love to know, how can people find you? How can people work with you?
Several options. You can find me at my website, which is my name, staceyramsower.com. Stacey is with an EY. And I am on Instagram. I don't use any other platforms than Instagram, and that's just Stacey_Ramsower. I share a lot there, and I'm always posting about what my offerings are. But I'm offering in 2025 New Moon Women's Circles. I work with a combination of somatics and expressive arts therapy and the element of community in those circles. And the theme really is, what's working you? What's up? Where's the thing that you're wrestling with? And let's use some of these tools to find more flexibility in our response and also connect with others. And I think one of the most healing elements on planet Earth is women circling. So that's a commitment of mine this year. Gather the women in a circle and just let the magic happen. I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. And depending on when this airs, at the end of February, I'm offering a 3-week somatic boundaries course called The Soul of Boundaries. So it's a lot of what we've talked about here, which is leading into my next 9-week program. My spring offering is called the Emergent Mother, and it is about this element of intimacy as an emergent unfolding process. So it's a lot of somatic practice with women in community related to the experience of desire, safety, choice, consent. That's what I'm up to right now. I work with women one-on-one, and all of that info in terms of how to connect is on my website.
And we'll put all of that in our show notes, anything that we
Thank
have
you.
Links to as well, so that people can easily find you. And again, just thank you so much for being you, for doing what you do, for being here today. To our listeners, thank you for opening your heart, your mind to this conversation. And my invitation to you would be, after this episode is over, taking a moment to just notice any sensations that exist within you, and let us know what came up for you through this conversation. I mean, I feel like this was more of an experience than a conversation. And reach out to us, send us a DM, let us know what you felt. Leave a comment on YouTube, or however else people engage with podcasts. And I know for myself, I just send everyone so much love. Sending so much love to you, Stacey.
It's mutual. Thank you so much, Katie. What a great opportunity and just way to start the day. Thank you.